free and universal medical services, total access to education, even college degrees, absolutely for free. Social success in Cuba is a reality, but the American blockade has caused distortions and obstacles in the international market for the Cuban products. Nevertheless, all this is changing. A few years ago, it wasn't common seeing this kind of private restaurants here in Havana. Now, they are everywhere. Congress delegates of the Cuban Communist Party passed a plan to update the economy, which has suffered a blockade for more than 50 years. But what this update means for the Cuban people and for the foreign investors? Young people like Professor Juan Triana lived the crisis of the 90s. He has become an specialist in the Havana University. He studies how the changes in the economy will help the Cuban people. Is it a reform? That's a correct word.
I would like to call it more reform than updating. First of all, it's very hard to talk in Cuba about an economic model ex ante. Usually, an economic model is an ex post definition. You cannot define an economic model like this before you're doing some things. What you can do ex ante is designing some development strategies depending on your actual conditions, based on your reality. And based on that, and based on what you see in the future, what could happen in the future, then you start issuing that strategies, that development strategies, and after 5, 7, 10 years, depending on how long is your short or your medium term, then you can define what is your economic model and how it is going to be transformed in the future. What we can see in the last 7 years is from the very beginning with the guidelines of the Communist Party and the revolution, you can see there, reading in black and white, some ideas, some guidelines that have become the program, the economic program of these modern reforms. So that is what is happening right now, and it
what
is.
What are the priorities of this update
well,
or
priorities,
reform?
Yes, priorities. In my personal opinion, the first one right now is toward the unification of the dual currency system in the country, which was a transitory reform. Okay, it just helped us to solve some problems we had by those years, and it was think that the government was going to change that in the next 5 or 7 years. What happened? In 2003, 2004, when the government decided to eliminate the dollar circulation inside Cuba, we kept the dual currency system. We have the CUC and we had the C.U.P. and we have it until now, creating huge distortions inside the Cuban economy.
That's very, very interesting. We're now in these private restaurant spaces. Yes. Let's talk a little bit more inside. So this kind of places is what you were talking about, the new changes, the private sector.
Besides the dual currency system, the reopening of the private sector have been one of the most encouraged reforms that the government have been issuing since the last 4 years, since October 2010, like these restaurants you have here. It's a new kind of opportunities for Cuban people to be done.
So what are the ways in which the Cuban economy is supposed to grow with these changes?
There is a sort of reforms that touch every single point of the Cuban society, of the Cuban economy. And the government have been issuing many things in many areas. For example, the government have been saying that growing is not a sufficient condition for our development strategies. The government have been saying that growing is a necessary condition for develop ourselves in the future. Is a necessary condition to achieve what we're trying to build, which is the Cuban socialism, something pretty different than what we start building in 1959, or what we can say right now we were building in 1959 until 1989. So I think it's very important right now for growing. Not only rises the productivity rate, efficiency rate, also trying to canalize inside Cuba the foreign investment we really need. Why? Because Cuba can't buy everything we need to produce or to invest in infrastructure inside Cuba with Cuban pesos. we need to have hard currencies like dollars, like euros, and the way to attract that inside Cuba is through the foreign investment.
But the blockade could be a problem, the North American blockade against Cuba, in this
order?
order?
Of course. The blockade has been a problem since February the 7th, 1962, until now, have been costing more than $150 billion to Cuba and start being a huge obstacle for the Cuban economy. Why? Because on one hand, there are many foreign companies that stop when Cuba asks to invest in, because they know that if the Foreign Asset Control Office of the Treasury Department of the United States track these kind of transactions between Cuba and any other company or any other foreign bank, they can fine this foreign bank with $1 million, and that is really unprofitable. It's awful for these companies. That's why they just decide not to come in. So for a foreign company coming in to invest in Cuba is a top hard decision to come in.
It's a risk.
It's a huge risk. That's why, for example, those companies that allowed us to have trade with them, all those banks that allowed us to do some transactions through them, they charge huge interest rate to Cuba in order they can grant it when this Treasury Department of the United States fined them for doing transactions with Cuba. They could have found to pay for that.
Foreign investors could have interest here in Cuba.
Cuba is almost a virgin country. We have many areas to invest in, not only tourism, like we have been doing since the last 24 years, also the mining, like nickel and tobacco and food production. Cuba right now is importing about the 80% of the food we consume every single year, about $2 billion every single year. So, and we have many opportunities to produce, for example, rice, beans, corn, and some other commodities inside Cuba. And to do that, we need money. We need money for machinery and equipment that we don't produce inside Cuba.
Technology.
Exactly, for technology. We need money for infrastructure inside Cuba, and that money must come through foreign investment. That's why the government have been saying that we need about $2.5 billion every year as a foreign investment. My personal opinion, perhaps twice that amount of money every single year, in order that we can reach about a 7.3% of GDP rate to achieve our goals. To achieve our goals of as a development strategy.
There's some perception around the world that these changes in Cuba, it's only towards private sector or migration reform, which we had one, and that's part of it. But there are other things like the dual currency issue, we were talking about it. What would be the benefits if that's eliminated?
This day zero means that from that day further, companies in Cuba must show their balances in C.U.P, not C.U.C. So the currency will be C.U.P.
So the C.U.C will disappear?
Yeah, C.U.C will disappear from the Cuban economy. What happened? This dual currency system doesn't stand alone by itself. It is one reform that must come in relation with some other reforms, like a salary reform. That will be very important. And we're not talking about only multiplying the 24 Cuban pesos for prices that people has right now in the government store. We're talking about setting an economical, fundamental exchange rate that reflects the real stage of the Cuban economy. On the other hand, we're talking about already start in some areas of the Cuban economy, a salary reform, like for example in the biotechnological sector. So people must understand that there is not only one idea about this unification of the dual currency system. There is a full understanding about what the government must do. They are starting these changes inside this monetary system in Cuba by going first to the business sector. It is one
and
of
then
the,
for people.
And then for the people, exactly. The end will be a unified real exchange rate.
For the young people, Juan Alejandro, that were born and raised in the cold special period, which was a very severe economic crisis after the falling of the Soviet Union, what does these changes could mean? For example, here we are in this private restaurant for the young people. This is natural.
Yes. I mean, this new reopening of the private sector in Cuba and this encouragement of the government to the private sector is something not only new, it's something that have been internalized by the young people, in my personal opinion, very strongly. I mean, people really like what is happening right now because it means opportunities, many and new opportunities to be independent. And independency is something very, very good. It's something that young people really like in Cuba. I mean, right now, young people are reaching to touch with their very hands the changes that are happening right now. Perhaps 25, 20 years ago, people were thinking about going to someplace else in the world, not because perhaps political reason, but for sure because of economical reason. Right now they are saying, okay, let's stay here for the next 2 years to see what is going to happen. I'm seeing new opportunities. I have to prepare myself in order that I can face these new changes, in order that I can take advantage from what is happening right now. And
more employment, for example? More employment?
Yes, exactly, more employment. I mean, right now, for example, Cuba has about 4.5, 4.7 million people as a total labor force. And there is 468,000 people working in the private sector. So it means a lot. Why? Because you can move from the public sector to the private sector, which is right now pretty more profitable. The government is trying to change the salary policy in Cuba. They start on the biotechnological industry. These people are earning more money right now, but
they're exporting to their products.
Of course, that's something. That's the key issue. These people export. These people really earn money. The incomes of the biotechnological sector exactly are 450. $500 million every single year. But professors, for example, we do not earn hard currencies. So the government is trying to move from those very profitable sectors to these other not that profitable sectors in order that people can earn more. What happened? This movement could be slowed. And because of this new reopening of the private sector, young people are saying, I'm not going to wait that much. I'm going to move to the private sector right now to improve my life quality, which is something I really need, and it's something very good.
That has to do with the fact that we are seeing here in Havana some phrases that has to do with the political discourse here in Cuba that says that is the economic battle or nothing.
Because Cuba, since the last 25 years, have been going through a very hard crisis. Since 1990.
Do you think there's a political will to solve these problems?
Yes, of course. I think that there is not only a political will, there's a very strong political will to solve these problems. Not only trying to develop our country, not only trying to canalize foreign investment inside Cuba, also, for example, against corruption. There is a full political will since the top levels of the government, since Raul himself, going through the some other levels, some other administration level. What happened is very hard in Cuba to change a certain way of thinking that have been going on since the last 40 years. So changing these people's minds is not impossible, but takes time. That's why it's very important to realize that those people that want us to rush our reforms are just trying to make us fail. These reforms needs time. What happens? Sometimes some reforms are been going slower than they should, because in Cuba it's not only about changing the economy. In Cuba, changing the economy goes also about changing Cuban people's minds, and that needs time to be changed.
Are you optimistic about all this, like a young professor?
I'm more optimistic right now. Why? Because professors and people that work for the public sector, they can work also for the private sector. So you can have this dual hiring stage condition. Everything goes about this. New opportunities, because it changed people expectations. And people expectation is a key issue for the government and the new design of the economic policy of Cuba.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been very interesting